Hi, everybody. Welcome to the latest in our 2026 series of OSF Essentials webinars. These are focus sessions on different OSF topics each month, built around the questions, workflows, and practical needs that users most often want help with. So we invite you to join us on the last Thursday of every month for one of these sessions. I'll talk a little bit at the end about what our upcoming topics are. This month, we're going to talk about how to use FAIR metadata to share the meaning, context, and importance of your work. I'll have some more information, as I said, at the end of the session on our future series webinars and some other training opportunities from COST that will be coming soon. So just some reminders before we get started. Please use the Q&A box for questions. This will be in your Zoom controls, probably at the bottom of your screen. It may be under the More button. We'll try to answer as many questions as we can during the session. At the end, I have some colleagues here who will be able to help you out with those questions. Feel free, though, to use the chat to introduce yourself. Or other kinds of comments as well. But questions we'll probably notice best if you put them in the Q&A. And you will receive an email with the recording and the slides after this session is completed. So let's go ahead and get started. So today we're talking about how to use FAIR metadata, and I'm going to talk later about what FAIR really means here. But specifically, we're going to talk about what metadata even is, why it's important, and then we'll talk about the FAIR guiding principles and how to implement them in your work. So let's start with what metadata is. If you're unfamiliar with metadata, the simplest explanation is that it is all of the information a system or a database stores about the content you create or you are interested in finding. So some of it is information you add when you upload an object, and some of it is created and retained by the system that you're uploading it into. The word metadata means the data we used to describe the data we're interested in finding. So let's look at some examples just to make sure we really understand. So starting with something fun, let's say we're looking for a movie to watch. So in this case, the film is the data. But in order to find the movie, we need to search through some kind of text. That is the metadata. In this case, it includes the title, the genre, the release year, the running time, description, and cast. So we've got some text here that we can search through to identify what we want to find. In an example that might be more familiar to our research, we can also look at a journal article. So if we think of the article as the data that we're looking for, the record that we find in the database when we're looking for it is the metadata. In this case, the metadata was probably created partly by the authors who created the abstract, for example. But it was also probably created by professional indexers at this journal who create the subject terms and other standardized terminology that's in this metadata record. Sometimes metadata is hidden or embedded in something, created as a byproduct of the system that creates it. So, for example, an email is data, right? But it also has a header with information about who sent it and when. But there's also actually more information in that header than you may realize. There's hidden metadata that tracks identifier numbers and IP addresses, and you can see it if you choose to look at the full header. But sometimes we don't necessarily see all the metadata that is available or embedded with an object. Metadata isn't only for textual materials, as I also showed with the movie. This, in this case, is a picture of my cat, Clementine. And next to her is metadata that is actually encoded in the JPEG file. So you can only see this metadata when you use a tool that knows how to show it. So in this case, Adobe Lightroom. Oh, went to the next one. There we go. So the file name, the date it was created, the technical characteristics of the image, like the size and the file format, all of those things are recorded automatically. If I want to, though, I can go in and manually add more information, like a title, a caption, or a copyright statement. Without that metadata, I don't have any textual information about this image. So the metadata is key to humans understanding what the data is and finding it. Sometimes the line between metadata and data is blurry, and it depends on the research question you're asking. So in this case, I have a call log on a phone bill. On the one hand, this is metadata about the calls that were made. But in another case, the log itself might be data that we're looking for if we're analyzing call trends across a population. So data and metadata can be somewhat fuzzy of a boundary, and it depends to some extent on the question you're trying to ask. So I think we've established what metadata is, but you may not have really realized all of the jobs that metadata does. So as we've already said, metadata is often what powers a search engine. So you can sometimes directly search through text when it's available, but searching metadata is actually more efficient because it's very clear and consistent, and it's consistently labeled and uses consistent terminology. But metadata is also crucial for that non-textual data. It may be the only way to describe and identify what it is that you're looking at. So I wouldn't know what this picture was of, that it was of the pink Pleiades, without the metadata. Metadata can also provide standardization of terms that might be used in different ways. So in this collection, I've searched for cat, and cat has lots of meanings. In this case, it's identifying an animals, maybe a title, a type of scan. So if I instead search for the standardized name Panthera leo, which is the taxonomical name for a lion, I get more consistent and accurate results. And even if the term isn't used in the original data, if the journal that this is referencing here uses the word lion, or maybe it's in another language and it uses leon or löwen, the metadata can still contain the term Panthera leo, and I can bring together all of these accurately described resources in one place. Metadata also increases reusability, which we'll talk about again. You can compare this file that has very little metadata to this one. And you can see that with the latter, we know more about what this data is and whether or not we could reuse it. So we'll talk more, as I said, about reusability specifically. So finally, when we look at OSF, we can see that objects have both data in files, in components, in the answers to questions in registered study plans, but it also has metadata like titles, contributors, tags, and activity logs. So now we'll move on to the main focus of this webinar, the FAIR guiding principles. So FAIR is a set of principles developed in 2016 to make scientific data easier to share and understand. FAIR is an acronym for Findable, Accessible, Interoperable, and Reusable. So I'm going to talk more about what each of these means specifically in a moment. But first, I think it's important to talk about the overall goals of the FAIR principles, because this is a term that gets used a lot. Maybe you've already heard it. After this point, you'll probably notice it again and again. FAIR is a guideline that helps us make sure our metadata is as complete as it can be and in a format that's as useful as possible. But it also addresses the distinction between data and metadata that's easily understood and accessible by humans versus data that's easily understood by machines. That means data that is indexed, that can be indexed, sorted, searched, and analyzed by algorithms. So it's important that data be readable to both machines and humans because each plays a different part in the discovery process. Machine readability makes data findable in the first place. It allows you to search through a massive amount of metadata at once and helps with the location of relevant content via algorithmic processes. The FAIR guidelines really focus on machine readability more so than human readability. So this can make them kind of confusing if you're reading them as a researcher who doesn't necessarily run a whole publishing system for research materials. But human readable data is also important once we need to actually interact with objects. completeness, accuracy, and clarity are all key to actually comprehending and reusing content, to understanding its context and nuance. So what do I mean by machine and human readable? Well, normally I would say that machines don't have intelligence to infer meaning from words, but obviously that is a fast-moving topic these days. But generally, machines do need more structured information to be able to use it. Structured data contains labels or categories for the information found within it, and those aid then in identification and recall. You don't have to necessarily understand the text to sort and index it by the type of data it is. If things are labeled consistently, we can create code that will recognize the labels and organize the data accordingly. And then we can also write programs that understand those labels. So the text here on both sides is exactly the same content, the same information, but one side is highly structured and would be very easy to index, and the other side is very human readable. So a search or analysis of metadata that's machine powered has to be extremely consistent and formatted and uses a specific syntax. Well, search and analysis that's researcher powered can leverage things like colors and layout and other clues that humans can understand. So the FAIR guidelines tend to focus on the former, but it has been extended by many to aspects of human readability. So now that we understand a little bit about the purpose of FAIR, we're going to go through the principles, and we're going to talk about the principle itself, and then we're going to talk about a human touch kind of way to interpret it, a way that you can help to implement that principle in your metadata. And then we'll also talk about some extra credit things that you can do additionally to improve. So the first principle is findability. These are characteristics that make it possible to find content of interest through metadata. So findability principle number one is that metadata or data are assigned a globally unique and persistent identifier. And the human touch there is that you create DOIs for your content, you can create an ORCID identifier for yourself, and you can explore other kinds of identifiers that you can create and implement in systems. The system's role is to hold and store and identify that it is an identifier, but you're the one who creates the identifier. Data are also described with rich metadata. So use as many metadata fields as possible, fill them in completely. The next principle is that metadata clearly and explicitly include the identifier of the data it describes. This is something that is really just for the system to take care of. And finally, metadata are registered or indexed in a searchable resource, which means that you should pick a stable and field-accepted repository to upload your content to. So the extra points here are that you can accomplish a lot of this by putting your content in a repository. Generalist repositories like OSF, or your institution's repository if it has one, or a specialist repository in your field. All of them give you tools to accomplish a lot of these findability aspects, like assigning persistent identifiers and the ability to create descriptive metadata. The next principle is accessibility. This means that once the content is found, users can get access to it or understand how to get it. So to be accessible, first, we have to have metadata that is retrievable by its identifier using a standardized communication protocol. That's really a system issue. And that protocol is free, open, and universally implementable. That's handled by the system, but you can also consider the universality of the formats that you use for the data that you're describing. Apologies about that. Let's restart so I have my notes. Okay. The next principle then is that protocol that you're using allows for authentication and authorization where necessary. And your role in that is to make your permissions clear and your licenses clear so that those systems can use the proper permissions for authentication and authorization. Finally, metadata should be accessible when the data are no longer available, and you can help that by documenting as much as possible. So for extra points here, you want to ensure that your content can be retrieved by adjusting permissions based on your data's sensitivity. You can promote open access wherever possible. Sharing your research doesn't have to mean giving away proprietary information, violating privacy, losing control of how research is reused, or sharing everything. But it means being as open as possible and as closed as necessary. You can keep some things private and other things public, as is shown in these two components, one of which is private and one of which is public. You can also consider a temporary embargo for your content. This will allow you to keep your data private for some period of time while you work on publication, but it will eventually be released to the public. Expanding that idea of accessibility, it can also extend to the formats you choose to use to save your work in. So when possible, it's encouraged to save your data in widely used non-proprietary file formats like CSV for spreadsheets, TXT for text, PDF as well, which is not on this image. MP3 and JPEG are also now open formats. If you have special characteristics in proprietary software, you can still, of course, use those. But an accessible option would be to create a version in one of these open formats and explain how to use that instead. The interoperable principle of FAIR encourages the easy sharing of metadata through standardized terms and practices. This applies to the technical protocols and standards used in the repository, but it also can be applied to the language you use to describe your content and the linkages you create between them. So to be interoperable, we want data or metadata to use formal, accessible, shared, and broadly applicable language for knowledge representation. So you can, again, write clear and complete metadata and documentation. Pretty much every rule has reinforced that if you haven't noticed. Metadata should also use vocabularies that follow FAIR principles. And this means that you should incorporate standardized terms where you can into your metadata. And I'll talk about that in the next slide. Metadata should also include qualified references to other data and metadata, so you can cite related items or other materials. So for extra points, in your repository, you want to choose as many open options and standards as you can. So in OSF specifically, you can use built-in standard vocabularies and schemas. We offer them specifically for subject headings. You can also have the ability to add additional metadata in several community standard templates. So the example here on the right shows metadata that has been added to a project or registration using the PsycDS format. In OSF, we also always recommend linking related outputs and outcomes to your work to make a network for all of your research that can interact and be interoperable with each other. So once you've created a registered study plan for your work, come back and add the outputs of that work so that you can have it all together and all findable in the same network. Finally, reusability, which we already talked about a little bit. You may have initially used this content, but this principle means that you're making it possible for others to reuse it later. So to be reusable, we want to create metadata and data that are richly described with a plurality of accurate and relevant attributes, which once again means robust metadata. But we also want metadata and data that are released with clear and accessible data usage licenses. So set licenses for your content and understand what they mean. Metadata are also recommended to be associated with detailed provenance. And that means use things like track changes features and document the provenance or the order in which things happened in your project and in your content. And finally, metadata and data should meet domain-relevant community standards. So for extra points related to usability, think about provenance and tracking activity transparently. You can include detailed protocols, analysis scripts, custom code used in data processing. Um, Thorough documentation like that allows others to replicate your work and understand the origins of your data. You can do that, and you can also do other things by including a plain text README file. It can explain how to access and use your data. It can give details on software or tools needed to open files, and it can explain access restrictions or requirements. The file should also specify your data or code's relationship to other files, so it can explain the relationship between code and data sets and manuscripts. So the comprehensive README ensures that your data can be used and interpreted by others. Also, repository systems may offer you ways to do version control. So in OSF, for example, our activity log tracks updates that are made to files. And this offers a transparent history of changes for future users to see what had happened. You can also and should include an appropriate license. Adding a license to your project allows others to copy, distribute, and use your data while allowing you to retain copyright. So OSF has a number of license options built in, and you can also upload your own if the license provided doesn't meet your needs. A well-chosen license promotes transparency and fosters reuse, and it actually encourages the proper attribution to you as the creator of content. So we've seen a little bit about how metadata can be used, and the FAIR guidelines provide you with some tips on maximizing that impact. Putting in that effort helps you in many ways. So we showed that metadata is crucial to how people find and understand your work. So better metadata will enhance your impact and collaboration opportunities. Increasingly, funders and other institutions are requiring that you share data, and the creation of metadata helps to ensure that you're complying with that. That helps funders know that they are supporting work that can be disseminated and reused. Things like funder information, conflict of interest information, proper licensing are some key things you may need to have in your metadata to comply with those rules. But finally, you can help your future self by following FAIR practices now. In the future, you may forget a lot of details about what you're working on right now. And at that point, you would be like any other researcher finding your work for the first time. So you can save yourself frustration of not being able to find something you know exists by documenting it well now. So what's the 101 here? If you remember nothing else, think of these tips. Begin with the end in mind. Structure your work with FAIR principles in mind from the beginning, even before data collection starts. You can document that in a registered study plan on OSF, and you can also create data management and sharing plans that help you determine what steps you're going to take to share data and when those steps will occur. You also don't have to do all of this at once. You can take one first step. Even incremental changes can have significant impact. So take one of these principles and try and implement it in your work if you're feeling a little overwhelmed by doing all of it. Finally, you can create reusable templates for yourself that would make it easy to maintain consistency across different projects. And there are plenty of resources out there that can help you, for example, figure out how to structure your README. I had a link in a previous slide, which you can go to when you get the slides after this, that can help you create that template for a README file so that you know you're always doing it consistently and completely. If you're feeling confused or overwhelmed, help is out there. Visit OSF Support Center, help.osf.io, to find guides on metadata and other related topics. You can also find helpful info on the Center for Open Science blog, as for example, in the post that's listed here, and that contains a lot of the content that we talked about today. You can also continue to join our monthly webinars for deep dives into topics that will help you improve your research practices. And you can explore a wealth of previous webinars at the Center for Open Science's YouTube channel. At that point, we're gonna take it to questions. So let me take a look. I'm going to stop the share for a second so I can see what's going on. It looks like we have one question. Um, so the question is, why are only OSF affiliated institutions discoverable on OSF? This is a very good point. If we were able to add the institutional information for everybody, that would greatly add metadata. The problem is that we need to be able to verify that a person is, in fact, a member of the institution that they're a part of. So we need to uh, coordinate with institutions to be able to authenticate people as belonging to the institution. So that's why we only offer the the verified institutional affiliation on data that's created by members of institutions that we've partnered with, because we can verify that they are actually members of those institutions. So we're always interested in working with institutions to add more of those. Next question about the post-registration publication. Where can I place my published article in the OSF project files or pre-registration? So the best way to do this is actually to create a registration for your um, research. Apologies, I should have probably had this open. Let me share my screen again. So if you create a registration for your project, you create kind of like a hub for all of the parts of the project. So if I go down here, I can find examples of registrations for projects that have published papers. So if I look at this one, for example, I see up here that these badges are filled in, and that means that the people who created this registration described what they were doing, what their hypothesis was, what their sample size, variable, etc. Now that they've completed that project, they've come back and added a link to their data, a link to their resources, a link to their materials, papers, and supplements. So this is a really great way to just come and very basically put the link to your paper, and you can have multiple papers. This one has just one of each, but you can have many of each of these. And you have a link that is very clearly labeled as this is the paper that was the result of this project. It's a really nice feature to use. The next question, I believe, is how do repositories like GitHub work in terms of FAIR principles? That's a great question, actually. GitHub is a little bit of a different animal because it's a repository specifically created for code. Oh, I thought I was logged in. Um, so GitHub relies a lot on READMEs. Um, let's see if I can get to a project. So this is a GitHub project I created that created a repository. So you can see I can include README files, licenses, um, all kinds of information that is really useful, like what we talked about. And this README is searchable along with all of the other, content that's in the repository. Um, that would be the best way in GitHub to make sure that you're, complying with FAIR. Another thing would be, um, for example, here are a bunch of digital objects that were in this digital repository that I built. And you can see I tried to use as much as possible file formats like CSV and PDF and JPEG, ones that were, really interoperable. So a lot of the FAIR principles, they affect or they are related to metadata, but if you remember, in a lot of those principles, they said metadata and data can have, metadata and data are richly described. Metadata and data are released with clear and accessible data usage licenses. So a lot of the principles apply to metadata, but they also apply to the actual content that you're creating as well. Someone responded that there's not a way to get a DOI on GitHub, and that is true. Um, so it depends on, I believe it's true. I'm not an expert on GitHub. But different tools are good for different jobs. So, perhaps you want to create in a repository some aspects of your project, like a paper about this project could be in a repository where it could get a DOI and it could reference back to GitHub. And that's another part of that interoperable principle, if you remember, where things link to each other. OSF does have an integration with GitHub in OSF projects. Basically, what that does is display what's in GitHub within your OSF project. So it essentially does the linking action of linking between your project space and your GitHub space. DOIs can be created in many repositories. So there's a comment in the questions here about Zenodo, but pretty much most of your good repositories out there will help you get DOIs or other persistent identifiers. It looks like maybe our questions are slowing down a little bit. To my panelists, is there anything in comments or questions that I missed or should respond to? Sounds like maybe not. So before we wrap up, there we go. Just want to again remind you that this is an ongoing series. So you can sign up for more OSF Essentials webinars. These are some of the topics that are coming up this summer. Licensing basics, how to use PIDs, and digital preservation of research data. That's one I'm going to do. I'm pretty excited about. So you can sign up. You can find out more information at cos.io/events/OSF. As I mentioned, we also have a new self-paced training program for individual researchers. So you can get a badge for completing courses. These courses are designed to help researchers build practical skills in various parts of the research life cycle. So the first two courses are available now, Fundamentals of Open Scholarship and Pre-Registration and Registered Reports. And as you can see, we have a bunch more planned for the rest of the year. And like I said, you can get a badge for these if you complete the course and pass the assessment and enroll in the course. So you can find out more about that at cos.io/training/self-paced. I do see one more question was added to the questions. Are countries from South Globe considered within OSF? Can NGOs that own community data partner with OSF in publications? OSF is open to anybody in the world who wants to have an account. So yes, anybody can get an OSF account for free and anybody can use OSF for free. If you're interested in some more specific kind of participation or coordination, you can contact us through our support desk, and we can start a conversation about some other kind of formal program. But anybody in the world is free to use OSF and create projects and registrations and upload their preprints. So I think we will end for today. I want to thank everybody for attending. As I said, you'll receive an email follow-up with the link to the video and the slides. So again, thank you all and go out there and create some good metadata. Have a great day.